We are live. It's good to hear your voice. I'm excited for this conversation. The new currency, the new challenge to the dollar. The reserve currency of the BRICS. I definitely want to talk about that. I want to talk about de-dollarization and some stocks, some new investments that are of interest probably to both of us. So let's start with the BRICS, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Willem, he's the fund manager of the CD fund, mainly focused on natural resources and precious metals. And you could probably explain it a lot better than I can. But yeah, let's start talking about the BRICS currency. And there's supposed to be this meeting in South Africa this month. What is supposed to take place at this meeting in South Africa?
Nobody knows for sure. Um, but I think the most important fact or point to understand is that you have this BRICS alliance, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. This has been um, an alliance which is getting more important by the day. It never was that official of an alliance. It was. I think there was an analyst of Goldman Sachs who coined the term BRICS 20 years ago. But these five countries understood that they have a common interest. They have many common interests, and one of those common interest, is to look for a solution how they can make the international monetary system um, how they can change the international monetary system so it is more fair for all countries. Because if you study the current system, the current international monetary system, that was designed by the US. They started working on that in 1942. They presented it in Bretton Woods to the world and invited countries to accept the US dollar system. And what we see now is that the BRICS organization, they more or less seem to follow the path the US followed in the 1940s. So the BRICS decided to be more united and to invite countries to join them to build this parallel financial trading system. And it could evolve into something like they have their own currency one day. That's what Russia's trying to do. That's what we have seen some Russian statements that the BRICS will introduce even a gold backed currency one day. But I think the most important point to understand now is that um, during this BRICS conference in August in Johannesburg, they will officially invite a few dozen of countries to join them to build this new system. And it gets very interesting because in the names of countries willing to join the BRICS alliance, also Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are mentioned. And this, when especially when the Saudis will join the BRICS alliance, you could conclude that the Saudis have pivoted from the west to the east, and the Saudis were very important to support the current dollar system because we have the petrodollar deal, which was founded in 1974, and which is a very strong foundation for the current dollar system. So if the Saudis decide to join the BRICS alliance and will start selling their oil in other currencies than US dollar, and we've seen a few first of these trades where they sold their oil in non-dollar currencies, then it could be very important for the current international monetary system centered around the US dollar.
Yeah, so this meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa, is actually next week. It starts next Tuesday,
Yes.
and there was a bunch of talk that they were gonna talk about the new currency for the BRICS at this meeting, but the latest news I've read is that the currency is really not on the table at this meeting. That they're just working on some other issues, and maybe they're trying to grow, expand to more countries, I guess, grow stronger, and then currency might be on the agenda at a later date. What in your estimation, what would this new currency look like? Is there any idea of how it would work and what role gold would play in it?
Um, I think the most important point to understand is that these countries are looking for a way to settle trade within the BRICS alliance and to settle this trade in non-dollar currencies. And um, I think is China understands very well that the power of the United States really started in 1944 with the start of Bretton Woods and with the start of the US dollar system. So China understands very well when they can design a system in which a lot of the international trade is done in other currencies than the US dollar, and preferably in their currency or in a common BRICS currency, their position in their position in the world of trade becomes more powerful. And of course, this is a very dangerous development for the US. And that's why the US is, of course, ignoring these changes which might come to the international monetary system. But I think we can conclude that the BRICS are working on a parallel trading system. So we in the West will keep using the current way we trade, and we pay for trade, and we settle trade. But the BRICS countries will try um, to organize trade in a way it's settled without the current dollar-based system, and nobody knows what kind of currency they want to introduce and how they would like to settle this trade. But it's quite clear they're working on something very serious. And we should not forget that we have 140 countries in the world who are not joining the West in sanctions against Russia. And most of the countries, or almost all of the countries in Latin America, Middle America, in Africa, and the Middle East, and Asia are not joining the Western sanctions. And these countries are fed up with the Western double standards. They're fed up with the Western sanctions. They're fed up with the hypocrisy from the West. And it's quite clear that um, especially China has been working very hard to get all these non-Western countries coming over to their bloc, to their alliance. And when we will see the news that a few dozen of these countries will join the BRICS alliance, that will be very powerful. And we don't know where this will end, but it's a very serious development, and it's a very dangerous development for especially the US.
Hmm. Uh, okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here and sort of like push back a little bit on some of what you said. So, the EU is, like an economic bloc, and they have open borders with one another. If you fly into France, you can get all the way to Malta, without showing your passport again, right?
Yeah.
The Eurozone has one central bank, the European Central Bank. Obviously, the Eurozone has many different countries and cultures and languages inside of it, but it has one currency that everybody, uses in one monetary policy. How would this possibly work with the BRICS? You have countries like South Africa, China, Russia, very different countries with very different monetary policies and very different economies. How could this possibly come under one central bank and one currency?
Well, I don't think they will use one central bank, and I don't think they will use one currency from the start. Let's say the end of August 23. But I do think they work on a system which allows them to trade in non-dollar currencies. And I think the Chinese are very smart to organize this in a way that the international trade can be settled through an account within China or within the BRICS bank. You have there's a BRICS bank headquartered in China, in Shanghai, and which is run by Mrs. Rousseff, who used to be the Brazilian president. So they work on their own system. They work on their own way how they will be able to sell trade. So we shouldn't focus too much on one joint currency.
Okay. All right. So it's going to look a bit different. There might be several currencies, and there might be just a account for settling trade that's not actually a currency, that's not actually uh, you know like available for people to actually use. It's only for trade settlement. What role will gold play in this, and why is gold an important part of this conversation?
I think the BRICS countries understand that who has the gold makes the rules, and this has been an old wisdom in the world of geopolitics. And of we know for a fact that, especially after the great financial crisis we started in '08, countries like China and Russia have accumulated huge amounts of physical gold. And I think they understand that to build a parallel and competing system with the West, they can use um, the huge amount of physical gold they have accumulated to back a system in which the trade can be settled um, with an account which could be gold linked or gold backed. And I think that's where the confusion starts. So if you can settle trade with an account in Shanghai with the BRICS Bank, and this account will have a gold component. So imagine you export more of your stuff to China than you import, and you have a positive trade balance. You could settle this trade balance at the end of the year in gold terms, and this could be done through the futures markets in Shanghai. And I think that that's the way gold can be used to settle trade, and without the start of a fully gold-backed currency, which can be used by anybody in the world.
So just to explore this a little bit more, and I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but do you envision it actually at the end of the year, China would then actually load a bunch of gold bars, onto a big cargo plane and send it to that other country that's their, trade partner, or would it be sort of like what we see in the US, where we have like a gold vault, and one section of the vault is like for Cameroon. They put some bars in that room for Cameroon and some bars in another room for France. What do you think it'll be like?
I think the countries will have a special account with the BRICS Bank, the new development bank in Shanghai, and this account will be gold linked. So if they have a positive number on that account, I think they will be able to. If they want to follow that route, they will be able to put in a request and ask if the physical gold can be shipped to Cameroon. But they can also keep it within the BRICS bank within that account, and this is not that different from the way the Federal Reserve stores much of the gold of many Western countries.
Got it. Okay. So back in March, we had a little bit of a banking crisis. The Swiss had a little bit of a banking crisis. Some of the regional banks in the U.S. Came under pressure. We had a few bank failures. And all of a sudden, de-dollarization became a big topic in the headlines for a few weeks. And there was a lot of talk about de-dollarization and the downfall of the dollar. And now, 4 months later, I don't hear any talk of it anymore. And in fact, the dollar has had a nice, little rally in recent weeks. So is this theme a real thing? De-dollarization, is the dollar actually going to lose market share across the world in trade, and what is the alternative to the dollar?
Um, when I look at de-dollarization, I look for signs um, which tell me if more and more investors are putting their money into US treasuries. And what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years, that more and more countries, especially east of the EU, have started to offload treasuries. Russia sold all of their treasuries in the last 10 to 15 years and accumulated a lot of physical gold. China stopped buying, stopped investing in new US treasuries around 2011, 2012, and started accumulating a lot of gold in the last, 15 years. And it all shows that countries within this BRICS alliance don't want to depend on the US dollar anymore. They look for ways to be able to trade without using the dollar because they've seen that the US is using the US dollar and the international monetary system as a weapon time and again. So when you start to use the dollar as a weapon, it's not strange that countries will look for ways to do trade without the dollar. And that's what de-dollarization means to me. And now with the BRICS conference next week in South Africa, and now with the BRICS alliance inviting dozens of independent countries to join their system to try to avoid using the US dollar for international trade, that's huge. That's a huge de-dollarization trend.
Yeah, and the fact that Saudi Arabia is starting to cozy up more with China and even their former, main enemy, which is Iran. There's been some, olive, branches extended, between Saudi, and Iran. It definitely does seem like a shift away from the U.S. I'm not necessarily convinced that they're moving fully towards the east. I feel like Saudi Arabia feels like they're their own polarity of the world, and they want to just increase their power and their dominance. But yeah, it is definitely a shift away from the dollar. And just one more question on this topic. Why is it important for countries to move away from the dollar? Why has this become more of a theme and more of a topic in recent years? What is it that is so dangerous about the dollar?
Well, like I said, when the US uses the dollar as a weapon instead as a currency of trade. Many countries who don't feel they are very close friends with the US, and look what happened to the Middle East. Look up, look at the number of countries the US have been militarily active in the last the last few decades. And there are many countries who don't see the US as a friend. So there are many countries who are willing to harm the US or stop using the dollar. And in we've seen countries trying to avoid using the dollar. Saddam Hussein tried it in Iraq. What was it, 15 years ago, to start trading oil for other currencies than the dollar. Gaddafi had his plan for a Pan-African currency, which should be gold-linked or gold-backed. But these countries were never united. So the US, it was very easy for the US to get rid of Saddam Hussein. We know Saddam Hussein and Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but the US used 9/11 to attack Iraq. We know Gaddafi is not around anymore. So all these countries who tried to get rid of the US dollar all had some very bad experiences. But now the BRICS alliance feels strong enough to invite other countries to join them in this de-dollarization trend, because they know they are powerful enough to confront the US, to confront the West, because the BRICS economy is now larger than the G7 economy. The countries who join the US with Western sanctions on Russia, that's less than 1.5 billion people. And the 140 countries who join the West in sanctions on Russia, that's over 6 billion people. So it's a numbers game. They're stronger now. They feel stronger. So they understand when they are united, they can confront the West, they can confront the US.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I like how you explain that. And I think about when the U.S. Invaded Iraq in 2003. One of the images that sticks out in my mind of that is the picture of the American soldiers in the Iraqi central bank in Baghdad with all the gold bars.
Yeah.
He had stockpiled quite a bit of gold in the Iraqi central bank, and just something about that image. Like, we use this massive army, all this force to invade this country on false pretenses, and got the gold and the
And
oil.
we didn't we didn't start any sanctions on the US because they invaded Iraq. So all these countries who are now looking at the BRICS alliance and willing to join them, they're fed up with the double standards of the West. Remember the shock and awe campaign in Iraq? We dropped all bombs we could find on Baghdad. So it was a great show on CNN. And now when Putin is doing the same in Ukraine, we say he's a criminal.
Yeah, well, that's a touchy subject there, Willem. I mean, I think you could say the invasion of Iraq was a crime in 2003, and you could also say the invasion of Ukraine is a crime as well,
I
right?
agree. I agree on both. But why should we have sanctions on Russia when we don't apply sanctions on the US when
Hmm.
they are starting the same kind of war crimes?
Well, you said it earlier. He who has the gold makes the rules, right?
Yep. And that yeah. And that's why the US started in 1944, when the Bretton Woods conference was organized, the US had 20,000 tons of gold. That was the start of the system. They lost most of it in the 1960s because they had to promise in Bretton Woods that countries would always be allowed to trade in surplus dollars and exchange it for physical gold. So they lost most of their gold in the 1960s, where France and the Netherlands and the UK all exchanged the surplus dollars into physical gold. The French even sent a navy ship to Manhattan to pick up the gold from the New York Fed building down on Wall Street. And now we've seen China accumulating so much gold. Independent experts think China has over 20,000 tons of gold. Don't look at what's in the vault of the People Bank of China. Just add what the state banks own. Just add what the large companies own who are connected to the government. And the Chinese even had this program which was called Storing Gold with the People. So they asked and invited all wealthy Chinese to buy as much gold as they could, so that at a later stage this gold can be used if Beijing thinks that's appropriate, and that's the same what happened in 1933 when in the U.S. the Federal Reserve told Americans they had to hand over their gold.
Yeah, that's a good history lesson. Yeah, and France definitely asked for a lot of gold in the 1960s, and that's what sort of led to where we are today, and also why, yeah, the U.S. lost over half of its stockpile during that time. I want to switch gears to resources, natural resources, and why this is an important area for your fund to be investing in, and sort of how does that play into the big reset, which you wrote a book about. I think you're writing another book about it. Can you explain to us why metals, starting with gold and then going all the way down the line to things like copper and zinc, play a role in the world after the big reset?
Well, um, we were talking about the start of Bretton Woods system in 1944. So let's call that Bretton Woods 1.0. And then we had the fall of the US gold standard in the 1960s, US losing all its gold. We spoke about that. And that ended with Nixon closing the gold window in 1971. So 1971 could be this, we could say that's the start of Bretton Woods 2.0. And then the dollar was saved by this petrodollar deal with the Saudis. And now I think we're entering a phase, and this is also coined by Zoltan Pozar. He used to work with Credit Suisse. He's starting his own shop now. He's a very famous analyst, and he said we're seeing the birth of Bretton Woods 3.0 now, with the Ukraine crisis and the BRICS countries all uniting more or less behind Russia and China. And he said in his essay, and you can still find it online, he said we're witnessing the birth of Bretton Woods 3.0, and this is a new monetary system centered around commodities and gold. And we're moving away, that's what he said, from a paper-backed system, a dollar-backed system, to a commodity-backed system coming from the East, coming from the BRICS countries. So if that's true, and I'm of the opinion that his analysis is spot on, I think for the next few decades, where the BRICS system, the financial system coming from the BRICS, the parallel system, I think commodities and gold will become more important in dollar terms. So if you want to invest wisely for the future, I think you shouldn't depend too much on the paper-backed system, and you should depend more on the hard asset-backed system. And commodities, and especially gold, are the hardest assets of all. And that's why we chose at a very early age. In 2008, I started a fund. In 2007, I published my first book in which I explained a lot of this thesis that we were witnessing the end of a paper dollar system. And actually, I wrote in 2007 in my first book, it was only printed in Dutch, that we would see a huge crisis coming to this paper-backed dollar system within 15 years. Well, 15 years after 2007, that's 2022. And now we see all these changes coming. So I think this is a very important development. And for investors, this means that the next few decades will be very strong for commodities. And we've seen very strong decades in the past for all investors who used to invest in U.S. Treasuries. But well, we all have seen the crash in the bond market in 2022. So that's a huge sign. That's a huge sign of the change of the times.
Yeah, that's well said. And I kind of feel like the dollar is backed by liabilities to a large extent. And, hard assets like metals, gold, copper, what have you, they are actually assets because if you have them in your physical space, you own them, you can you can use them, and copper is, for example, is used in all the infrastructure that we build, and basically everything, from housing to the electrical grid to airplanes to cars, right?
Well, if you look at the commodity spectrum, I always say you have the precious metals, which is like the monetary
hmm
metals, gold and silver. Then you have the base metals,
hmm
which are getting more and more scarce as well. So copper can also almost be used as a monetary assets. And then you have the energy complex. Well, we all know what happens in the world of energy. Energy is getting more and more important by the day. And then you have the soft commodities, which are the grains and the coffees and the cacaos. And I, as an investor, always wanted to have a lot of exposure, especially to the hardest of all, to the precious metals, to the monetary metals. So I started to accumulate gold and silver positions from 2002 onwards. As a private investor, started to get very interested in the way hard assets were discovered by exploration companies, because these are the guys who really turn, well, moose pasture into a piece of ground which could be worth billions and billions. So that's why we as a fund always concentrated on hard assets, and especially on the most successful exploration company, because the full name of our fund is the Commodity Discovery Fund, and we focus on the best undeveloped mining projects worldwide, and preferably in the precious metals. But we also love a great discovery in nickel or in uranium or in diamonds or in copper.
Well, we have a new discovery in copper, potentially made in northern Canada, and I think that we're both interested in this, new discovery.
Yeah.
It's at a project called Storm Copper on Somerset Island, an island I've never been to, and not many people have. It's not inhabited by any human beings in far northern Canada. And this company, the symbol is Bay on the TSX Venture, has 20% fully carried interest in this project, but the operator is American West, okay, which is an Australian company. And there's been a couple of interesting pieces of news out of American West. Can you explain to listeners what is so interesting about Storm.
Yeah, it's not a potential copper discovery. It is a real copper discovery because it has been known for decades that there is a very large copper system to be discovered. Um, and this was known because there's some outcropping high grade copper on different places over a distance of 10, 20, 30 kilometers. We even have a piece of this very high grade outcropping copper in our office because we used to be a very significant shareholder in Aston Bay. 5 years ago, when Aston Bay teamed up with BHP to explore for this system. So imagine BHP, this huge company, is signing up an agreement with a tiny company like Aston Bay, which is valued sub 10 million, to explore this system. That's how interesting this system was for the BHP geologist. Well, Aston Bay wasn't very lucky 5 years ago in their exploration program. They had all kind of problems. It's in the Arctics. It's You have a very short season, a very short window of exploring. It's very expensive, and well, actually, we can conclude they failed. And we owned over 5% of Aston Bay at that time, and we sold it at a profit. So we were intrigued when we learned that the option to explore this project was taken over by the Australian listed American West, who can, gain 80% of the project by investing over $10 million. And now Australian or American West has been very successful in finding the higher grade copper zones at depth, which so many companies have been looking for in the last few years and even few decades. So this is a very serious discovery, and we jumped back in with both feet as soon as we saw the press release. So currently we own between 2 and 3% of American West, and we build a nice position in Aston Bay as well. Unfortunately, a private placement was cancelled because we would have taken quite a bit of that private placement. But I think American West is the best way to play it because they will own 80% of the project. So they are the operator and they are the most significant owner soon.
So it's interesting because I followed Aston Bay a bit back during that time, 2016, at the time that you're discussing where you had the fund had a large stake in the company, and I remember the programs during those summers, I think 2016, 2017, 2018, they didn't generate the results that many people were hoping, that they would, obviously, right? And that's why the project was handed back to the company, and that's why Aston Bay eventually, did the option deal, because just simply they didn't have the financial capability to explore at such a far flung location. But it is really interesting when this news came out a few weeks ago from American West, okay, which is an Australian company, as you said. And I read the news release and I'm like, hold on. This is something new, right? Like, this is not a discovery that was already known. They've drilled into a new zone, I would call it. And I have a feeling that you sort of saw it the same way, where it must have really caught your attention and said, hold on, this is something I need to really pay attention to more carefully. Is that right?
Well, it was always known that this is a very large, complex system. So, in a way, the system was already discovered, one could say. But with a major system like this, spread out over miles and miles, you always have to start drilling to be able to really discover the high grade zones underneath. And why American West is so successful now, they have shown with a quite limited drill program, only drilling a few dozen holes, that they were able to find several of the high grade copper zones underneath. And and this is so important because it shows all these structures which were always investors always thought the structures should be there based on the concept of the geological model, and also because of the geophysical research which had been done. So if you can prove that the geophysical structures, you know, can be found underneath, when you can prove they are so well mineralized and they contain high grade copper, all these geophysical targets which you know are there for miles and miles and miles, they all could be mineralized. And that's the importance of this discovery. But I told you that the window of opportunity, the window of exploration, is quite short because it's in the Arctics. So they need to stop drilling in a few weeks, and then we get a long winter, and they can only start exploring again in Q2 of next year, in May, June. So I think um, the the real significance of this discovery will only be um, will only be found next year. So the next year's drill program will open a few more eyes to this story.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was very well said. I'm looking at the news the company put out August 7th with a massive chalcocite in hole 3, 2303, 76 meters of massive copper sulfide. And then they put some core pics on page 2, that massive chalcocite in dark gray. Looks pretty impressive. I can't say I've seen core that looks quite exactly like that previously. But we're still waiting assays, so definitely want to throw that out there. There's no reason to get too
But we
terribly
know,
excited.
well, yeah, well, I don't agree.
Okay.
I am terribly excited because we know from the statements of the company, of the CEO of American West, that one of the holes which was drilled into what they call Thunder, which is a separate part of the system they discovered while drilling this geophysical target. He said it's a better the drill core from that hole from Thunder looks better than any of the core which has been found previously. And the best core found previously was like 20 meters at 4 grams of copper. So we know this drill hole in Thunder is very well mineralized, and you could end up with like intersections of 40 meters at 2 or 3% copper.
Yeah, that would be pretty good. I just want to say that I'm long on Bay and I'm long American West as well at the time of this space. I want to ask you one more question about this. Because of the option agreement, the one company is the operator and the other company has the 20% free carried. How do you view this as an investor, and how do you value, each company and their, the fact that one company has 4/5 and the other one has 1/5, but it's fully carried?
It's very difficult. So that's why we always play it from both sides in a situation like this. But in general, you can say that American West is way cheaper than Aston Bay. And I think that can be explained because Australian investors always find it hard to invest in a Australian listed company which has a project in a region they don't understand. And the Arctic, Canada, the Arctic region of Canada is something the investors down under they don't fully understand. So if this would have been a discovery made in Australia, American West would be valued much higher. And I think there's a nice arbitrage, and that's why we play it that way, that we invest more of our money into American West. And like I said, we bought around 3% of the company in the open market in the last few days. So we've been very aggressive, and we're very happy that, well, the most investors are still asleep about this situation.
All right, and final question, and maybe this one is a challenging one. Why is the mining sector so difficult for investors to make money in? It seems like, I could pull up 10 mining stock charts right now, and 5 of them look absolutely dreadful at or near 52-week lows. And it seems like just looking at the fundamental valuations of the mining sector, versus, let's say the tech sector. I mean, the mining sector is really in the poorhouse, and the market doesn't give it much respect.
Well, we've been in a bear market for 15 years. If you look at the CRB index, the commodity index, which topped in 2008. If you look at gold and silver, which stopped in 2011. So we've been in bear market for 12 years now. The valuation of commodity related companies touched a 100-year low late 2020, and it's still near this 100-year low. So as an investor, you always should invest in the strongest trends, and the strongest trends were tech in the last decade or so. And now I think it's time to invest more of your money into the very undervalued commodity space, because we are reaching this perfect storm now, where we get more and more shortages, where we have debasement of currency, a strong inflation, and we have the shortages developing. If you study the supply and demand for the different metals, we'll see more and more shortages arriving the next few years, and even the next few decades. So if you combine all of this, and you also have the competitive tension between the West and the East now we spoke about. So if you combine this, you could expect a very strong bull market for the next few years or even few decades. And I follow an analyst, Elliott Wave analyst A.V. Gilbert, closely, and he called the top for gold right in 2011. He's the only one I know who called the top right in 2011. He called the bottom right in 2016 for the precious metal complex, and it's his model which shows him and his readers that the commodity bull market, which started in 2020, will run till 2050, 2052, according to his metal. And that's the technical point of view. And I can back that up by the fundamentals. So that's why I think um, the, the, the tide is changing. So we had this very long bear market. We had a bottoming phase, which took years. We first bottomed in Q1 2016 with the commodity complex. Then we had a retest of the bottom in March 2020. And actually, as we speak, we have another retest of many of those bottoms in Q3 23. But once this is over and we break out, you can expect a massive bull market. And this could coincide very well with the start and the rise of the BRICS economy and the BRICS system.
All right. I want to open it up. If somebody has a question, I'll take one question for Willem. I'm going to ask you one more question. There's 4 types of gold, or 3 types of gold according to Posar: white gold, yellow gold, black gold. I would throw in red gold, which is copper. Which is your favorite gold at this point in time?
um, I have another white gold, and that's silver. uh, I think silver is the most undervalued precious metal out there. It might be the most undervalued metal out there. Silver is trading at 50% of its 1980 high. It's the only metal trading that low. Silver is used as a commodity for the industry. 60% of all silver is being used and not recycled. Most is not recycled, while gold is always recycled because of its high value. But we love the other white gold, lithium, as well, because there's a spectacular um, demand for lithium because of the EV, the Tesla revolution. And but people should um, should study lithium well, because lithium is not scarce. So that that also explains why you see so many lithium discoveries now. It's not that hard to discover lithium, and one day there will be so much lithium um, being discovered by exploration companies, and it will be very hard to turn them all into profitable mines. So I think the hype and the window for investing in lithium is that it could be a relatively short one compared to gold, silver, platinum, or palladium or copper.
So you don't think this is a paradigm shift that, this bull market is going to last for a decade? You think it's going to come to a close here shortly for white
Yeah,
gold?
yeah, because it's not that difficult to really jump production in lithium. As explained, it's not that scarce. You can discover it quite easily.
Mm.
We've seen Pilbara Minerals in Australia discovering their project and bringing it into production within a decade, I think in 6, 7 years, and being highly profitable. The same will happen in the James Bay area. I think some of the red tape will be will be removed by the government, because we need the lithium now. And then when lithium prices are that high and everybody is jumping into this investment hype, we'll see a point in time when things will come crushing down, the same like the uranium boom has ended in 2007, when we had 400 exploration companies all exploring for uranium. So you should understand these cycles. And also a warning for people at home. I always say, don't try this at home. So when I mention specific companies, don't put all your pension money into one or two of these funds, because they can always something can go wrong. And leave it to the professionals. And if I want to be invested into biotech or into pharma, I will look for a good fund manager who understands the business, and don't try to be smarter than the professionals. I think this is a very risky business.
Yes, it definitely is. It's a tough game we play. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a great conversation the last hour. I think we covered a lot of key topics, and I really appreciate your insights and your willingness to take the time to share it with all of us.
That was my
Thank you,
pleasure.
Willem.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope that you received some value from this video. Please stay tuned to goldfinger.capital for updates and new videos. Have a powerful day.